You think your grandparents just bought everything fresh from the store? Think again. Black ancestors across the South mastered the art of preservation, stockpiling foods that lasted months or even years without refrigeration. Here are 30 Christmas foods Black ancestors stockpiled that never expired. Salt-cured country ham was the centerpiece of Christmas tables and the ultimate preserved meat in Black households for generations. Whole hams were rubbed thick with salt, sugar, and sometimes black pepper, then hung in smokehouses where they aged for months or even years. The salt drew out moisture, while smoke added flavor and further preserved the meat. These hams could hang in cool, dark places indefinitely, developing deeper flavor as they aged. When Christmas arrived, the ham was soaked to remove excess salt, then baked slow until the fat rendered and the meat turned tender. Sliced thin, it graced breakfast tables and dinner plates throughout the holiday season. Families often cured hams from their own hogs, making each one a product of labor and tradition. Salt-cured ham represented security. Dried black-eyed peas were the good luck charm that Black ancestors stockpiled by the pound, knowing they would anchor New Year's tables for generations. Harvested in fall, the peas were dried until hard as pebbles, then stored in cloth sacks or glass jars where they kept indefinitely. When cooking time came, they were soaked overnight, then simmered low with ham hocks or fatback until creamy and rich. The tradition of eating black-eyed peas on New Year's Day promised prosperity, with each pea representing a coin. Families passed down specific recipes, some adding tomatoes, others preferring them plain with just pork and onion. Dried peas cost almost nothing, yet provided protein that rivaled meat. They were poverty food that became celebration food, stretching from slavery through freedom. Molasses was the sweetener that never spoiled, sitting in tin cans and ceramic crocks in Black kitchens for years without losing potency. This thick, dark syrup was a byproduct of sugar refining, making it cheaper than white sugar for working families. Mothers drizzled it over biscuits, stirred it into gingerbread, and used it to sweeten everything from baked beans to holiday cakes. Its deep, almost smoky sweetness carried iron and minerals that white sugar lacked. Molasses was essential for making traditional Christmas treats like stack cakes and pull taffy. A single gallon could last a family through winter, stretching sweetness across months of cooking and baking. It was stored in pantries and root cellars, always ready when needed. Molasses represented affordable indulgence that ancestors relied on for generations. Cornmeal was the foundation of survival that Black ancestors kept in barrels and bins, knowing it would sustain families through any hardship. Ground from dried corn, this golden powder lasted indefinitely when stored in cool, dry places. It became cornbread, hoe cakes, mush, and dumplings, stretching across breakfast, dinner, and supper. Christmas tables always featured cornbread alongside greens and ham, its slightly sweet texture soaking up Potlikker. Families bought cornmeal in bulk when money allowed, storing enough to last through lean months. Some communities operated their own mills, grinding corn from local harvests. Cornmeal required no refrigeration and no special storage. It was simply there, waiting to become something warm and filling. For Black ancestors, cornmeal meant certainty in uncertain times. Smoked sausage links hung in smokehouses and pantries, preserved meats that Black ancestors made after hog killings to ensure protein through winter. Pork scraps were ground with sage, red pepper, salt, and secret spice blends passed through generations, then stuffed into casings and smoked until firm. The smoking process dried the meat while infusing it with preservation that allowed sausages to hang for months. At Christmas, these links appeared in red rice, alongside eggs for breakfast, or sliced into gumbo and stews. Each family had their own recipe, some spicier, others more heavily smoked. Making sausage was community work, with neighbors helping neighbors process whole hogs into products that would last. Smoked sausage represented self-sufficiency and the knowledge that nothing from the hog went to waste. Dried apples were the preserved fruit that Black ancestors strung on thread and hung from rafters, creating sweet rings that lasted through winter and beyond. Fresh apples were sliced thin, then dried in the sun or near wood stoves until leathery and concentrated in flavor. Stored in cloth bags or jars, they kept indefinitely, waiting to be rehydrated for pies, stack cakes, and cobblers. At Christmas, dried apples transformed into fillings that tasted like autumn, concentrated into sweetness. Children helped with the drying process, threading apple slices onto string and watching them shrivel over days. The dried fruit was lighter than fresh, making it easy to transport and trade. Families with apple trees often had surplus to share with neighbors. Dried apples connected Christmas tables to autumn harvests. Lard was the cooking fat that Black ancestors rendered and stored in crocks, knowing it would keep for years and make everything taste better. After hog killings, fat was cut into pieces and cooked slowly until it melted into pure white liquid, then strained and poured into containers. Lard required no refrigeration when properly rendered. It became the foundation of flaky pie crusts, crispy fried chicken, and tender biscuits that defined Southern cooking. At Christmas, lard made everything possible, from the crust on sweet potato pie to the golden finish on fried fish. A single hog could provide enough lard to last a family through the year. Mothers measured it by the spoonful, knowing its value. Lard represented abundance stored against scarcity, fat saved for the day when it was needed most. Pickled pig's feet sat in glass jars on pantry shelves, preserved protein that Black ancestors could pull out months after preparation. The feet were boiled until tender, then packed into jars with hot vinegar brine seasoned with bay leaves, peppercorns, and sometimes hot peppers. The acid preserved the meat indefinitely while transforming its texture into something silky and rich. Served cold as a snack or warmed as part of a meal, pickled pig's feet provided protein that sustained families between paydays. At Christmas gatherings, jars were opened and shared, the tangy, gelatinous meat eaten with crackers or bread. Making pickled pig's feet was an art, passed from mothers to daughters, a tradition of using every part of the hog and wasting nothing. They represented resourcefulness, preserved in brine. Rice was the grain that Black ancestors stored in barrels and bins, knowing it would anchor meals for years without spoiling. In the Low Country and across the South, rice was more than food. It was culture, carried from West Africa through generations of enslaved people who cultivated it. Stored properly, white rice lasted indefinitely, ready to be boiled into fluffy grains that soaked up gravies, stretched stews, and accompanied every Christmas dish. Hoppin' required rice. Red rice required rice. Families bought it in bulk when prices dropped, filling containers that would sustain them through months. Rice was simple yet essential, the base upon which holiday meals were built. It was cheap, filling, and connected Black communities to agricultural traditions stretching back centuries. Salted fatback was the seasoning meat that Black ancestors kept in crocks and barrels. Salt preserved pork fat that flavored everything it touched. Cut from the back of the hog, this thick slab of fat was packed in salt until cured enough to last indefinitely. When cooking greens, beans, or peas, a chunk of fatback went into the pot first, rendering slowly and infusing the liquid with smoky, salty richness. At Christmas, fatback made collard greens sing and black-eyed peas rich. It cost almost nothing, yet transformed humble vegetables into soul food. Families kept fatback stored in cool places, slicing off pieces as needed throughout the year. It was poverty food that tasted like comfort, proof that flavor did not require expensive ingredients. Fatback represented the wisdom of preservation. Dried butter beans were the creamy legumes that Black ancestors stored in sacks and jars, knowing they would provide protein through the coldest months. Harvested from summer gardens, the beans were left on the vine until pods turned brown, then shelled and spread to dry completely. Stored in airtight containers, they lasted for years without losing nutrition. When Christmas cooking began, butter beans were soaked overnight and simmered with ham hocks until silky and rich. Their mild, buttery flavor earned them their name and made them favorites among children. Families grew their own or bought them by the bushel at harvest time. Butter beans stretched meat, filled stomachs, and cost almost nothing. They represented the wisdom of growing what you needed and storing it for lean times ahead. Sorghum syrup was the amber sweetener that Black ancestors pressed from tall grass stalks, creating liquid gold that never spoiled. The process was community work, with families bringing harvested sorghum cane to mills where it was crushed and the juice boiled into thick, dark syrup. Stored in jugs and tins, sorghum kept indefinitely in pantries and root cellars. Its flavor was complex, less sweet than molasses, but with earthy undertones that made it distinctive. At Christmas, sorghum topped biscuits, sweetened cakes, and flavored candies that children pulled by hand. A single gallon could sweeten an entire season of cooking. Sorghum represented self-sufficiency, a sweetener that families could produce without depending on stores or expensive sugar. It was independence stored in glass jars. Smoked ham hocks were the flavor bombs that Black ancestors hung in smokehouses, preserved joints that transformed simple vegetables into soul food. Cut from the lower leg of the hog, these bony, meaty pieces were cured with salt and smoked until deeply flavored and shelf-stable. They could hang for months in cool, dry places, waiting to season pots of greens, beans, and peas. At Christmas, ham hocks went into every pot of collards, lending smoky richness that no other ingredient could match. The meat that clung to the bones was prized, fought over by children who knew the best bites were hidden there. Ham hocks cost little because they were considered scraps, but Black cooks knew their true value. They represented the alchemy of turning discarded cuts into essential ingredients. Canned tomatoes lined the shelves of Black pantries, summer's abundance preserved in glass jars that would brighten winter meals. When gardens overflowed with ripe tomatoes, mothers worked for days blanching, peeling, and packing them into sterilized jars with salt. Sealed properly and stored in cool, dark places, these tomatoes lasted for years. At Christmas, they became the base for stews, the sauce for rice dishes, and the brightness in otherwise heavy winter meals. Home canned tomatoes tasted nothing like store-bought, carrying the specific flavor of backyard gardens. The jars themselves were treasured, washed, and reused season after season. Canning tomatoes was knowledge passed from mothers to daughters, a skill ensuring families never went without vegetables. They represented summer captured in glass. Dried peaches were the preserved fruit that Black ancestors sliced and dried in summer sun, creating chewy treats that lasted through winter and beyond. Fresh peaches were halved, pitted, and laid on screens or strung on thread to dry until leathery and concentrated in sweetness. Stored in cloth bags or sealed jars, they kept indefinitely, ready to be rehydrated for cobblers, pies, and hand pies when fresh fruit was only a memory. At Christmas, dried peaches became fillings for fried pies, their intense flavor needing little added sugar. Children ate them as snacks, chewing the sweet, chewy slices like candy. Families with peach trees dried bushels each summer, trading surplus with neighbors who grew other fruits. Dried peaches connected winter celebrations to summer harvests, sweetness preserved against the cold. Salt pork was the preserved meat that Black ancestors packed in barrels, slabs of fatty pork cured in salt until they could last indefinitely. Unlike bacon, salt pork was not smoked but simply salted until the moisture drew out and preservation set in. It sat in crocks and barrels and root cellars, ready to season any pot that needed richness. At Christmas, salt pork went into beans, greens, and stews, rendering slowly to flavor humble vegetables with porky depth. A small piece could transform a pot of nothing into something satisfying. Salt pork required soaking before use to remove excess salt, a step children learned by watching mothers prepare it. It was peasant food that tasted like wealth when cooked properly. Salt pork represented survival, protein preserved against times when fresh meat was unavailable. Pecans in the shell were the nuts that Black ancestors gathered by the bushel, storing them in burlap sacks where they kept for years. Fall meant pecan harvesting, with children shaking trees and gathering nuts from the ground until sacks overflowed. Stored in cool, dry places with shells intact, pecans remained fresh and flavorful indefinitely. At Christmas, families cracked them by hand, the sound of shells breaking filling kitchens as pies and pralines were prepared. The nuts went into everything from cakes to candies, their rich, buttery flavor essential to Southern holiday baking. Gathering pecans was free, requiring only time and labor, making them luxury ingredients available to even the poorest families. Pecans represented the South's abundance, freely given by trees that asked nothing in return. Cane syrup was the thick, golden sweetener that Black ancestors boiled from sugarcane juice, creating a product that never spoiled and sweetened everything it touched. In sugarcane country, families brought harvested cane to mills where it was crushed and the juice collected in large kettles. Hours of boiling reduced the liquid to thick syrup that was poured into tins and jugs for storage. Cane syrup had a cleaner, lighter sweetness than molasses, making it preferred for biscuits and pancakes. At Christmas, it topped everything from cornbread to sweet potatoes. A single gallon could last months, stretching sweetness across an entire season. Cane syrup represented regional tradition, a sweetener tied to the land and labor of sugarcane cultivation that Black workers knew intimately. Dried field peas were the humble legumes that Black ancestors harvested and stored by the pound, protein that would sustain families through any hardship. Crowder peas, lady peas, and purple hulls were grown in gardens, left on vines until pods dried, then shelled and spread to cure completely. Stored in cloth sacks or glass jars, they lasted for years without losing nutritional value. At Christmas, field peas simmered with pork until creamy and rich, served alongside rice and greens as part of the traditional spread. Each variety had its own personality, some creamier, others earthier. Families often grew several types, ensuring variety through the winter months. Dried field peas required no refrigeration and cost almost nothing to produce. They represented food security grown from the soil itself. Pickled beets sat in jewel-toned jars on pantry shelves, preserved vegetables that Black ancestors made when summer gardens overflowed with crimson roots. Fresh beets were boiled until tender, then peeled and sliced into jars filled with hot vinegar brine, sweetened with sugar and spiced with cloves. The acid preserved them indefinitely while transforming their flavor into something tangy and complex. At Christmas, pickled beets appeared on tables as a colorful side dish, their sweetness cutting through rich meats and heavy starches. Children often loved them for their candy-like taste, despite their vegetable origin. The pickling liquid itself was sometimes saved and used to pickle eggs, stretching resources further. Pickled beets represented the art of preservation, turning summer abundance into winter color. Honey was the golden sweetener that Black ancestors harvested from hives and stored in jars, knowing it would never spoil no matter how many years passed. Beekeeping was common in rural Black communities, with hives kept near gardens where bees pollinated crops while producing liquid gold. Honey was strained and poured into glass jars or ceramic crocks, sealed and stored indefinitely. Its sweetness was complex, carrying the flavor of whatever flowers bees had visited. At Christmas, honey sweetened teas, glazed hams, and added moisture to cakes that stayed fresh longer than those made with sugar. A single harvest could provide enough honey to last years. Honey also served as medicine, soothing sore throats and healing wounds. It represented nature's perfect preservation, sweetness that time could not diminish. Dried corn was the preserved grain that Black ancestors hung from rafters and stored in bins, knowing it would sustain families for years. Ears were left on stalks until husks turned brown, kernels hardened, then harvested and dried further in barns or attics. Stored properly, dried corn lasted indefinitely, ready to be ground into meal, boiled into hominy, or parched for snacking. At Christmas, dried corn became the cornbread that accompanied every meal, the mush that warmed cold mornings, and the dumplings that stretched stews. Some families saved seed corn from year to year, maintaining varieties their ancestors had grown for generations. Dried corn required no special storage, just a cool, dry place. It was the grain that built the South, sustenance that Black hands planted, harvested, and preserved. Vinegar was the sour liquid that Black ancestors made from scraps and stored in jugs, a preservative that never spoiled and made other foods last longer. Apple peels, fruit scraps, and even stale cider were fermented into vinegar that could sit in pantries for decades. Its acidity preserved pickles, pig's feet, and vegetables while adding tangy brightness to greens and slaws. At Christmas, vinegar went into everything from pickled beets to the splash that finished a pot of collards. Mothers kept vinegar crocks going continuously, adding scraps and drawing off finished vinegar as needed. The process required patience but no money, transforming waste into something valuable. Vinegar represented the ultimate in resourcefulness, turning scraps destined for compost into an essential kitchen staple that would never go bad. Cracklings were the crispy pork pieces that Black ancestors rendered from fat and stored in lard, preserved protein that added crunch and flavor to everything. After hog killings, fat was cut small and cooked slowly until it rendered into lard, leaving behind golden, crunchy bits that were strained out and saved. Stored in the very lard they created, cracklings lasted for months without refrigeration. At Christmas, they were stirred into cornbread for crackling bread, eaten as snacks, or crumbled over vegetables for richness. Children loved their salty crunch and begged for handfuls while mothers cooked. Cracklings were free, a byproduct of rendering that would otherwise be discarded. They represented the philosophy of wasting nothing, turning every bit of the hog into something delicious and useful. Hickory nuts were the wild harvest that Black ancestors gathered from forests and stored in sacks, free protein that lasted for years in the shell. Fall meant foraging for hickory nuts that had fallen from towering trees, gathering them by the bushel before squirrels claimed them all. Stored in cool, dry places with shells intact, they remained fresh indefinitely. Cracking hickory nuts was tedious work. The shells harder than pecans, but the reward was rich, buttery meat unlike any other nut. At Christmas, hickory nuts went into cakes and candies, their distinctive flavor marking holiday treats as something special. Gathering them required only time and knowledge of where trees grew. Hickory nuts connected Black families to the land, wild abundance freely given to those willing to do the work. Preserved figs were the sweet treasures that Black ancestors put up in jars, summer fruit transformed into syrupy preserves that lasted for years. Fig trees grew abundantly in southern yards, producing more fruit than families could eat fresh. The excess was cooked down with sugar into thick preserves or dried whole for storage. Jarred in syrup and sealed properly, preserved figs kept indefinitely in pantries and root cellars. At Christmas, they appeared on biscuits, in cakes, or eaten straight from the jar as sweet treats. The syrup itself was treasured, drizzled over pancakes or stirred into hot water for a warming drink. Fig trees were often passed down through generations, the same trees feeding families for decades. Preserved figs represented abundance captured and stored. Dried hot peppers hung in bunches from kitchen rafters, preserved heat that Black ancestors used to season food year-round. When pepper plants overflowed with ripe pods in late summer, the excess was strung on thread and hung to dry until leathery and concentrated. Stored in jars or left hanging, dried peppers lasted for years without losing potency. At Christmas, they were crumbled into greens, beans, and stews, adding heat that warmed from the inside out. Different varieties provided different flavors, from smoky to fruity to purely fiery. Growing peppers was easy, and drying them required no special equipment. Dried hot peppers represented flavor that cost nothing but time, heat preserved against cold winter months when gardens lay dormant. Rendered tallow was the beef fat that Black ancestors saved and stored in crocks, a cooking fat that lasted indefinitely and served multiple purposes. When beef was butchered, fat was collected and rendered slowly over low heat until it melted into clean, white tallow. Strained and stored in cool places, tallow remained solid and fresh for years. It was used for frying, making soap, and waterproofing leather. At Christmas, tallow fried potatoes and made flaky pie crusts when lard was unavailable. Some families mixed it with lard for cooking, stretching both fats further. Tallow was harder than lard, with a higher smoke point that made it ideal for high heat cooking. It represented resourcefulness, turning what others discarded into something essential for daily life. Peanuts in the shell were the legumes that Black ancestors grew and stored by the bushel, protein that lasted for years and fed families through hard times. Peanut plants were harvested in fall, the entire plant pulled and hung to dry before peanuts were stripped from roots. Stored in burlap sacks in cool, dry places, peanuts and shells kept indefinitely. At Christmas, they were roasted in ovens or fireplaces, boiled in salty water, or ground into homemade peanut butter. Children cracked shells and ate them by the handful, while adults worked in kitchens. Peanuts grew easily in southern soil, requiring little care and producing abundant harvests. They were peasant food that tasted like treasure, free protein from the ground that sustained Black families for generations. Preserved watermelon rind was the sweet pickle that Black ancestors made from what others threw away, transforming waste into a delicacy that lasted for years. After watermelon flesh was eaten, the white rind was cut into cubes, soaked, and cooked in sugar syrup with spices until translucent and candy-like. Packed into jars and sealed, Preserved rind kept indefinitely in pantries. At Christmas, it appeared as a sweet relish alongside ham or as a treat eaten straight from the jar. The flavor was unique, sweet and slightly spiced, with a tender, crisp texture unlike anything else. Making preserved rind was an art passed through generations, a reminder that resourceful cooks wasted nothing. It represented creativity born from necessity, sweetness made from scraps. Cornmeal dressing replaced traditional bread stuffing in 1930s Black Christmas kitchens when wheat flour prices climbed beyond reach. Cornbread was crumbled days ahead and left to dry, then combined with sauteed onions, celery from the garden, sage, and whatever drippings could be saved. The mixture was moistened with potlikker or broth, packed into baking pans, and baked until the top turned golden and crusty while the inside stayed moist. Some families added giblets or oysters when available, but most kept it simple and let the cornbread's earthy sweetness carry the dish. Cornmeal dressing appeared alongside whatever protein the family could manage, chicken, rabbit, or wild game, stretching the meal further while providing filling satisfaction. Children loved the crispy corner pieces best, fighting over them at the table. The dish represented practical wisdom, using cheap and available ingredients to create something festive. Cornmeal dressing proved Christmas flavor came from care and seasoning, not expensive ingredients. Sorghum.
Soot biscuits were the kind of food you learned to trust when the fire was all you had. They were baked in soot-covered Dutch ovens, set right into the coals until the smell of toasted flour filled the air. The outsides came out black and charred, but inside they were soft, warm, and sweet from the faint taste of smoke. You brushed off the ash and split them open, steam rising like a small blessing. They were eaten with syrup, molasses, or even gravy if the morning allowed it. Families traveling, camping, or working the land knew this trick well. It was food that came straight from the earth and fire, raw and honest. Soot biscuits did not look like much, but they carried pride. They were proof that comfort could come from the simplest effort, that even ashes could feed the body and soothe the soul. The smell lingered on your hands and clothes, a reminder that good things sometimes came wrapped in smoke. Each bite tasted like work and gratitude, the flavor of survival baked in real flame. Okra fritters with corn silk were the kind of kitchen magic that only came from necessity and imagination. In the long summer months, when the fields were full and money was not, people used every part of what they harvested. The corn silk that clung to the ears was not thrown away, but saved and shredded, added into batter alongside chopped okra, flour, and a splash of milk or water. When dropped into hot oil, the fritters puffed and crackled, their edges turning golden and crisp. The smell was something you could follow from down the road. Warm, nutty, and sweet with that faint scent of corn. Each bite was crunchy on the outside and tender in the middle, with little strings of corn silk that gave it texture and charm. They were served with syrup or vinegar, depending on what the family had, eaten right out of the pan when patience ran out. Okra fritters with corn silk were food born from care and cleverness, proof that waste had no place in a humble kitchen. Every family had its own version, passed quietly between generations, carrying the taste of late afternoons, hard work, and simple joy. They were poverty's poetry, fried into something worth remembering. Molasses coffee was not fancy, but it was strong enough to keep a person going through the longest of days. When coffee beans were scarce and sugar even scarcer, someone clever discovered that a spoonful of blackstrap molasses stirred into hot water or weak brew could make a drink both sweet and smoky. The result was thick and dark, with a bitterness that clung to the tongue and warmed the chest. It tasted like work and resilience, like fields at sunrise and factory bells ringing. Families drank it early and often, some adding milk if fortune allowed, others taking it plain with bread crusts for breakfast. It was a poor man's luxury, a small rebellion against hunger and fatigue. The smell alone was enough to wake the tired and remind them that strength could be stirred, not bought. Molasses coffee was courage in a cup, shared by hands cracked from labor and hearts that refused to quit. It carried the spirit of people who built their mornings out of willpower and steam, proving that dignity could live even in the thinnest brew. Cowpea and collard stew combined two powerhouse ingredients that sustained countless families through hard times. Field peas, also known as cowpeas, were simmered slowly with smoky meat and joined by hearty collard greens, creating a dish rich in protein, vitamins, and earthy flavor. The long cooking process filled homes with an aroma that signaled comfort and nourishment. Farmers valued cowpeas for their ability to thrive in poor soil, while collards offered leaves long after other vegetables had withered. Together, they made a meal that cost little but fed many, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and care. Mothers and grandmothers seasoned the pot with onions, garlic, and pepper, each adding a personal touch passed down through generations. Families gathered around the table with slices of cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, finding strength in every spoonful. Though supermarkets now offer endless choices, the slow-simmered union of cowpeas and collards stands as a reminder of a time when simple ingredients created enduring nourishment. Cowpea soup simmered like a prayer whispered over a fire. The pot would start with water, a scoop of dried field peas, and maybe a scrap of salted meat if the week had been kind. Onions and garlic joined in, releasing their scent as the broth thickened into something golden and strong. The cowpeas, small and sturdy, softened slowly, their flavor deepening with every hour. This wasn't fast food, it was patient food, built on rhythm and time. Families made it during harvest, when work was hard and hands needed warmth. It was ladled into tin bowls and passed around without ceremony, each bite grounding you in gratitude. Sometimes cornbread floated on top like an offering, soaking up the last drops of broth. The soup tasted of earth and labor, of simple things done well. Cowpea soup was both meal and memory, tying together generations who had learned how to make plenty out of little. It was food for body and spirit alike, humble but whole, strong but
Vinegar pie emerged as the Christmas dessert of necessity in 1930s Black households when lemons were imported, luxuries no family could justify. The filling was simple: sugar, flour, butter, eggs, and sharp white vinegar providing tartness without citrus, mixed together and poured into a homemade crust, the pie baked into a smooth custard that trembled slightly when moved. The flavor surprised those expecting something harsh, delivering instead a balanced sweetness cut with gentle acidity that cleaned the palate after rich holiday meals. The pie cost pennies since every ingredient was a pantry staple, yet it tasted special enough for Christmas. Children often didn't know what gave the pie its distinctive tang, and mothers rarely told. Vinegar pie represented the ingenuity of Black cooks who refused to let poverty mean going without dessert, who understood that substitution and creativity could produce something genuinely delicious. The pie proved that Christmas sweetness came from love, not expensive ingredients.
Okra fritters, also known as okra cakes, offered crisp golden edges and a tender interior that celebrated the summer garden. Fresh okra pods were chopped fine, mixed with cornmeal, onions, and a dash of pepper, then spooned into hot oil until each patty puffed and browned. Sold at fish fries, church picnics, and traveling fairs, these fritters were easy to eat by hand and full of flavor that tied African heritage to southern soil. The okra gave a subtle sweetness and a soft binding that kept the patties moist, while the cornmeal crust provided satisfying crunch. Children waited impatiently beside bubbling skillets, hoping for the first fritter to cool enough to taste. Vendors wrapped them in newspaper cones so families could stroll through evening air scented with music and spice. Modern snack foods have replaced these handcrafted treats, but those who remember the sound of oil popping and the taste of garden-fresh okra know the fritters carried more than flavor. They held the joy of gathering and the pride of turning humble crops into a festival of taste. Syrup bread emerged as the answer when there was nothing to eat but flour and whatever sweetener could be found. Sorghum syrup or molasses, cheaper than sugar and available throughout the South, were drizzled over plain biscuits or cornbread to create something approaching dessert. Black children learned to make this treat themselves, mixing flour and water into simple doughs, baking them quickly, then drowning the results in dark, sticky sweetness. The combination provided quick energy, carbohydrates from bread and concentrated sugars from syrup, delivering calories needed for labor. In sharecropping families, syrup bread appeared frequently because sorghum was often the only sweetener accessible when white landowners controlled access to refined sugar. The practice taught children to find joy in small pleasures, turning basic ingredients into treats through imagination and willingness to make something from nothing. Women sometimes added a little butter or lard to the bread if available, creating richness that complemented syrup's sweetness through ingenious adaptation. Syrup bread emerged as the answer when there was nothing to eat but flour and whatever sweetener could be found. Sorghum syrup or molasses, cheaper than sugar and available throughout the South, were drizzled over plain biscuits or cornbread to create something approaching dessert. Black children learned to make this treat themselves, mixing flour and water into simple doughs, baking them quickly, then drowning the results in dark, sticky sweetness. The combination provided quick energy, carbohydrates from bread and concentrated sugars from syrup, delivering calories needed for labor. In sharecropping families, syrup bread appeared frequently because sorghum was often the only sweetener accessible when white landowners controlled access to refined sugar. The practice taught children to find joy in small pleasures, turning basic ingredients into treats through imagination and willingness to make something from nothing. Women sometimes added a little butter or lard to the bread if available, creating richness that complemented syrup's sweetness through ingenious adaptation. Pig feet and collard greens brought together two ingredients that white society dismissed, but black communities transformed into soul-satisfying meals. Pig feet, boiled until tender and gelatinous, released collagen that thickened cooking liquid into rich, silky broth. Collard greens, tough and bitter when raw, simmered in that broth for hours until they turned tender and deeply flavored. The combination created a pot of food that could feed 8 people for under 50 cents during Depression years. Black cooks added vinegar and hot peppers to cut through the richness, creating layers of flavor that made each bite interesting despite simple ingredients. In sharecropping communities, this dish appeared regularly because both ingredients were readily available. Pigs provided feet even when better cuts went to landowners, and collards grew abundantly in gardens. The potlikker left behind was considered as valuable as the greens themselves, sopped up with cornbread or saved for cooking rice. Children learned to appreciate pig feet's unique texture, the meat slipping off bones and the skin turning silky after long cooking despite crushing poverty. Pan-fried gizzards were the kind of meal that proved patience was as important as any spice. Tough and chewy at first, these scraps of poultry were transformed through slow cleaning, seasoning, and frying into golden bites of pride. A bowl of seasoned flour, a splash of buttermilk, and a hot cast-iron skillet were all it took to turn what most people ignored into something worth gathering for. The gizzards hissed in oil until they were crisp on the outside and tender within, each one carrying the smoky taste of hard work and heart. Families would pile them high on paper towels, watching the steam rise like a promise that dinner was ready. Every batch felt earned, every crunch a reminder that flavor came from care, not wealth. Children gnawed at the edges, soaking the last bits in hot sauce, while elders nodded in approval. Pan-fried gizzards were food that spoke of resourcefulness, a celebration of making something special from nothing. They filled kitchens with the sound of sizzling survival, the scent of seasoning that lingered long after the plates were empty. In every bite was proof that thrift could taste like triumph.
Hog's head cheese appeared on Christmas sideboards across black households in the 1930s, transforming the least desirable parts of the pig into a cold-cut rival in any store-bought meat. After the fall hog killing, women simmered the head for hours until meat fell from the bone, then picked every usable scrap: cheeks, snout, ears, and tongue. The meat was chopped fine, seasoned with sage, black pepper, and vinegar, then pressed into loaf pans where natural gelatin set it firm overnight. Sliced thin and served cold, hog's head cheese offered protein lasting through the holidays without refrigeration. The dish cost nothing beyond salt and spices, since families used parts that would otherwise go to waste. Children spread it on cornbread, not knowing they were eating the wisdom of generations who refused to let anything go unused. Hog's head cheese represented the philosophy sustaining Black families through slavery, Reconstruction, and Depression. Waste nothing, honor everything, find richness where others see only scraps.
Onion skin tea was one of those old remedies that could quiet both body and soul. When someone had a cough or a fever, or when food simply ran out, a pot of this humble tea came to the rescue. Dried onion skins were gathered from the corners of the kitchen, rinsed and steeped in boiling water until the liquid turned golden brown. The scent was sharp but comforting, a mix of earth and sweetness that filled the air with warmth. Some added honey if they had it, or a squeeze of lemon, but even plain, it had its own charm. People believed it could heal and strengthen, and maybe it did, because hope itself can be medicine. Onion skin tea was born from patience, brewed by hands that knew how to stretch every last bit of life from what they had. It was the taste of resilience and care, a sip that made you believe tomorrow might be gentler.
Which preserved food from your ancestors' pantry do you remember most? Drop your memories in the comments. Hit like and subscribe for more forgotten traditions worth remembering.